One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, welcome back to the Inflammation Nation podcast. Give me a second while I adjust my camera. So we're continuing on now and, pardon me, starting to near the end of our discussion on the 5 pillars of hormone balance and control. And so far we've worked our way to talking about the first 2 pillars, which, just as a quick reminder, are insulin and blood sugar control and stress chemistry, as well as adrenal function. And if this is the first episode that you've listened to, then you might want to go back and start from the beginning of this particular mini-series or collection of episodes talking about hormones and health, because we laid a lot of groundwork before we got to the point where we are right now. And today we're going to be talking about pillar number 3, which is gut health. And that's kind of a pivotal pillar, if that's even a phrase. The reason why I say that is because the gut is a pillar in and of itself, but it touches on the final 2 pillars, which are inflammation as well as detoxification. And as with many aspects of human function, it is useful to distinguish between one thing and another and talk about them as if they're separate. But of course, human function is nothing but completely integrated and interdependent in terms of its subsystems. And so we can't really talk about the gut without talking about inflammation. We can't talk about the gut without talking about detoxification, just like we can't talk about insulin and blood sugar control without talking about stress hormones, cortisol. And we can't talk about those things without also talking about inflammation, because it's all interconnected. And so let me start by saying that when it comes to gut health, there are probably 3 main categories where we can see changes in the gut environment having an impact on hormone balance and control. And one would be inflammation. And even though we're going to have a separate discussion on inflammation as the final pillar, we have to talk about inflammation as it relates to inflammation that's being driven by the gut. So inflammation is one part of gut health that has an impact on hormones. The other one is certain types of bacterial infections and a mechanism by which they can start to uncouple hormones that were tagged for clearance and allow them to recirculate. We'll come back to that. And then finally, the third aspect is the microbiome. Now, could we tease out more details? Sure. But these are probably the main categories, certainly the ones that have the most research behind them. And the microbiome, its main role is in terms of gut-based detox. And I know normally when we think about detoxification, we think about the liver, perhaps the gallbladder, but the gut microbiome plays a role in that as well. And again, we'll come back to that point. So let's talk about gut and inflammation. You may have heard this statistic before. It's been around for a very long time. It is true. So it's not one of those internet myths that gets perpetuated. But the reality is that when we look at inflammation as a feature or an output product of the immune system, the vast majority of inflammation that we have circulating in our bodies is related to things going on in the gut, because the mucosal system of the gut houses about 70 to 75% of all of the immune cells that we have. And so the gut is a major player when it comes to immunological function, as it comes to either controlling or driving inflammatory responses. And of course, this is one of several different reasons why naturopaths of old started saying things like health begins in the gut. And I wish I could attribute that to whoever the original author was, but I honestly have no clue. But nevertheless, we kind of in the natural medicine world have this belief that the gut is very, very important. And it's only in the last probably 15 to 20 years of research that we've understood exactly why. And we are constantly discovering new things every year. So we understand that the gut has, the intestinal system has a lining. So think of an open tube, and inside the inner surface of the tube is lined with what's called epithelial cells. They produce a thin layer of mucus called the mucosal system, and associated with this mucosal layer just on the inside of the intestinal system itself is what we call the submucosal immune system. And so as things come into the gut and either get actively carried across the gut barrier into circulation, or they get passively diffused, or in some cases, critters and toxins and chemicals can hijack transport systems to get out of the gut into the bloodstream. In between those two out of the gut into the bloodstream points is the immune system. And that makes a lot of sense from, let's say, an engineering or a design standpoint, simply because there are only a couple of ways that things get into our bodies, things that can either poison us or infect us. And that would be through cuts in the skin, or the absorption or the translocation, simple word, translocation, going from one place to another, translocation across these barrier system tissues, whether that's the gut barrier, the respiratory barrier, or say the blood-brain barrier. But nevertheless, the gut plays a massive and essential role in either generating or controlling your total inflammatory load. And so what ends up happening is, if there is something that is increasing the inflammatory chemical production in this gut-based mucosal immune system, these immune chemicals, most of which we call cytokines, they can exit the gut via two different pathways and actually get out into systemic circulation and have impacts in areas that are not the gut itself. And so the inflammation in the gut can certainly affect the gut environment and how the gut behaves and how it either improves or maintains or loses function over long periods of time. But these cytokines don't stay in the gut. They actually have a free pass across our barrier systems. So it is possible, actually easily possible, for inflammatory chemicals to be produced in the gut, to get out of the gut, to go up, cross the blood-brain barrier, and affect the brain. And this is one of the mechanisms by which we see, say, either dysbiotic or food-based reactions in the brain that might lead to things like brain fog or depression or anxiety or lack of focus and concentration. And that's the whole part of the whole brain-gut axis that we've mentioned a couple of times in different episodes. But let's talk about these two different exit pathways with these gut-based cytokines. Number one is through the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system is basically a transport mechanism to get immune-based chemicals and cells from one place to another. Obviously, the lymphatic system is not the same as your vascular system, so blood gets transported through arteries and veins, and lymphatic fluid, which includes a whole bunch of things, including different types of immune cells, as well as all of your cellular waste from normal cellular function, gets collected in the lymphatic system, gets kind of cleaned up by the immune cells that are in the lymph nodes, mostly macrophages. And it continues to kind of circulate around, and then the lymphatic system dumps its contents into the bloodstream, and then we detoxify that, and then we urinate it out, or we sweat it out. And that's kind of basically how the lymphatic system works. But the lymphatic system can be used by these cytokines to escape the gut and get into general circulation, where quite often the inflammatory response down-regulates our ability to clear and detoxify certain compounds. And so, yes, inflammation has the potential to really derail or decrease your ability to clear out things like heavy metals or toxins from bacteria or mold toxins or whatever the case may be. So that's one way. Chemicals, inflammation can get from the gut outside is through the lymphatics. The next way is through what's called the hepatic portal vein. And basically the hepatic portal vein is what drains blood from the liver into the general circulation. And, I don't want to turn this into just like a general anatomy lesson, but not obviously perhaps, when things enter circulation, pretty much the first place they go is to the liver. So the liver has a chance to look at that and decide, do I let it pass or do I break it down into something? If there's a threat, how do I modify that? And so the liver has a very large blood supply, and all the blood goes out into general circulation. And so again, why are we even talking about this? Because when the gut inflammatory state is upregulated, the inflammation does not stay in the gut. If it did, when someone's gut was inflamed, the only thing that they would get would be gut symptomatology. But we see a wide range of things like fatigue or brain-based symptomatology, joint pain, muscle pain, and as we've been discussing, and what's most relevant here is changes in hormone balance and control. What are the sources of inflammation? Like, how do we get to the point where the gut is upregulated with its inflammatory state and producing these inflammatory cytokines? Well, easy things to talk about would be things like food sensitivity. So just eating foods that your gut-based immune system is reacting to. And we can talk about the most common, we call it the big six, and that would be wheat, dairy, corn, soy, nuts, and eggs, or peanuts specifically, and eggs, and specifically egg white. Those are perhaps the most studied food antigens or food sensitivities or classical food allergies. But the reality is that your immune system can react to pretty much anything you eat. You can react to the protein structure in broccoli or in everyone's beloved kale, which I would argue is probably not as much of a health food or a superfood as most people think it is. But nevertheless, eating foods that you're reacting to, particularly if your gut-based immune system is reacting to those, can cause an upregulation of gut-based inflammation, which then escapes general circulation and can wreak all kinds of havoc on multiple different systems, not just the hormonal system. Then we can also talk about some other obvious things, like if you have an inflammatory bowel disorder. And I'm not talking about IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. I'm talking about inflammatory bowel disease, and that would include things like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, which are intestinal autoimmunities. And they are somewhat related. They can happen in the same person. Most people have either one or the other, but in essence, it's where the immune system is attacking the gut tissue, and not only do you get inflammation from the immune attack, but you get the outcome of that, which is destruction of tissue, which causes more inflammation, and on we go, and that inflammation doesn't, again, stay in the gut. And in fact, if you look at some of the neurological literature that looks at the etiology or the origin of some brain-based inflammatory findings, say on MRIs, there are many, many different case reports where the source of inflammation and perhaps even, lesions in the brain are tracked back to either Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So the bottom line is, if your gut's inflamed, very likely your brain is inflamed as well. And I know the context of our discussion today is hormone balance and the role that gut-based inflammation plays in that, but some things bear repeating just simply because they're so very common, but so misunderstood, especially in conventional healthcare. And then the final thing, just in terms of things that upregulate gut inflammation, would be whether or not you have, say, like a leaky infected gut. Do you have a bacterial overload? Do you have a fungal overload? Do you have parasitic infections? Do you have some kind of gut-based virus? Perhaps the most common thing that we find, if you talk to anybody who does a lot of specialty stool testing to look at the microbiome or the biotic environment, perhaps the most common finding is a bacterial overload. And that could be bacteria in the sense of a true infection where you get something that you should never have. Or it could be, let's call it a quasi-infection. We call it dysbiosis, where you get a shift in the normal relative distribution of good bacteria versus potentially bad. For example, H. pylori is a bacterium that's implicated in things like gastric ulcers, but also in things like heart disease. There are different types of H. pylori infections. Some secrete toxins, some don't. Some are more concerning clinically, some are not. But H. pylori, even though we think of it as a pathogen, we think of it as something that we should never have. The truth is, a normal, healthy gut has a small amount of H. pylori in it, but a healthy gut has a good microbiome and control of the immune system. So the H. pylori infection, if you will, doesn't get out of hand. And this is what happens in most cases when we talk about gut infections. We're not really talking about getting things that you should never have. We're talking about losing control of the balance between good and potentially bad players or critters in your gut. And so dysbiosis, again, is basically an overgrowth of microbes, particularly bacteria, that are normally in a healthy gut, but in very low populations. And as long as your gut-based immune system is healthy, then you keep control of that environment. But when you lose control, then we lose the control of the population, and the potentially bad players, which are otherwise neutral, then they start to overgrow and act as if they are an actual true pathogen. And so technically dysbiosis and infection are not the same thing, even though we tend to we tend to use them synonymously just because sometimes it's just easier to give a simple explanation. But nevertheless, if you have some kind of a dysbiotic overgrowth or infection in your gut, of course, the immune system should be active against that. And as long as the immune response is healthy and well controlled and efficient, then eventually the infection subsides or the dysbiosis subsides, and we go on about our business. And I would suggest to you that your gut environment is probably a lot more dynamic in that sense than you realize. You don't walk around with no challenges to your gut microbiome until the moment you get infected. The truth is, things wax and wane just based on your stress levels, your fatigue levels, your sleep patterns, your dietary intake, your environmental exposures. And so the gut environment is, if we could measure it moment to moment to moment, we would see a lot of variability. But as long as it happens within certain confines, then we tend to do okay. But what ends up happening in many cases is that some of these bacteria that tend to overgrow or infect us can secrete toxins. Perhaps the most well-studied are these things called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS. Lipopolysaccharides, these are bacterial endotoxins that are secreted by specifically gram-negative bacteria. And these toxins can be very damaging to the intestinal system, to the intestinal tissue, the mucosal system, and really fire up your gut-based immune system. And so, for example, I might have two clients that both have a dysbiotic overgrowth. And if one has a type of infection or dysbiosis where there is also the production or increased production of these toxic lipopolysaccharides or other toxins, because not all bacteria secrete that. Fungal species don't secrete that. Viruses don't secrete that. But there are a range of microbial toxins that do the same thing. So between two people who have a dysbiosis and one has these toxins and the other doesn't, the one who has the toxins is going to be a much worse case clinically and probably take more work to get to the point where we've got control of that environment and their symptoms are under control and their function and quality of life has improved. And so we have some kind of dysbiotic infection, let's call it. We have the potential for toxins, including but not exclusively limited to lipopolysaccharides. And then we have things like leaky gut. So you can have infections without a leaky gut. You can have a leaky gut without infections. You can have neither. You can have both. But bottom line is, when you have leaky gut, you're actually having an immune response against your own intestinal tissue, which technically is an autoimmunity in and of itself. Although it's a little more self-limiting than, say, like thyroid, Hashimoto's disease, or multiple sclerosis or type 1 diabetes. It's a different type of autoimmunity, but nevertheless, it still is an autoimmunity. And as a result, people who have leaky guts tend to have more gut-based inflammation. And what's the lesson? Well, whatever upticks your inflammatory response in your gut tends to affect the whole system. And part of that is the ability of inflammation then to dysregulate your hormonal system. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a different episode, but just to kind of give you the highlight right now is when you have this inflammatory cascade, wherever it comes from, it can dysregulate your brain's ability to coordinate the feedback loop between the brain and the reproductive organs making your hormones. It can impact how your hormones are processed and handled while they're in circulation in the bloodstream. And of course, it can jam up and alter the signals at the cellular level so that maybe you don't get the normal activation, even though you have a normal amount of hormones. And so, to say it one way, the inflammatory portion of gut health has the potential to dysregulate every aspect from top to bottom of all of your hormonal systems. And that's not just your reproductive hormones, it's your thyroid, it is your stress hormones, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that's the inflammatory piece. Now we have two more to talk about briefly, and then we'll close it for today. So the other aspect of this is that certain bacterial infections can activate an enzyme in the gut called beta-glucuronidase. And glucuronidase it's an enzyme that's actually derived from glucose, and so blood sugar control and regulation kind of feeds into this aspect here as well. But when somebody has beta-glucuronidase elevated, and we typically measure this, it's most of the labs, especially the ones that do a good job, are measuring for the presence of increased beta-glucuronidase because it's such a well-known phenomenon that certain dysbiotic overgrowths can activate beta-glucuronidase. And then what that does is it actually uncouples hormones, specifically estrogen, that has been tagged for clearance by the liver. Now, without getting into an explanation of detoxification in kind of like the bigger picture, basically as things flow through the liver, they can be transformed or biotransformed, which is the technical term for detoxification. They can be biotransformed into secondary or even tertiary metabolites that either get cleared out through urine or through feces or through sweat, or they can actually recirculate. And so what ends up happening is your body is processing estrogen because you have to, out with the old, in with the new, so to speak. If you have an increased beta-glucuronidase from certain types of bacterial infections or dysbiotic overgrowths in your gut, what ends up happening is the estrogen that was labeled to be eliminated gets disconnected from that mechanism and is allowed to recirculate. And so what ends up happening is you either get increased estrogen levels more than what your body needs to have because it's hopefully constantly making new stuff. Maybe you're taking it through medication and hormone replacement therapy, or instead of maybe the parent compound of estrogen being recirculated, maybe it's one of these secondary or tertiary metabolites, which, to be honest, we have very little information on what they are and what they do, which is, it is what it is. But there is a lot that happens in the hormonal terrain that we just simply don't understand because there's no research on them. Some of these compounds are extremely difficult to measure. They have very, very short half-lives. Maybe you can measure them, but you can't, or you can collect them, but you can't stabilize them to measure them accurately. And so there's a big question mark. All we know is that certain people who have certain types of dysbiosis in their gut have this increased enzyme, which changes how you detoxify your estrogen levels. And that's pretty important for some people. Obviously not all. And then finally, with the gut, let's talk a little bit about the microbiome and how the microbiome has the same detoxification capacity as the liver. If you've ever listened to any detox podcasts or done courses or whatever the case, you probably have heard of phase 1 and phase 2 detox. And I'll just give you a 30-second rundown on that. Basically, hormones and other toxins are they're what we call lipophilic, which basically means fat-loving. But in order for us to excrete them, we have to have them changed to the point where they're water-loving or hydrophilic. If something is lipophilic and loves to bind to and connect to fat, then it is hydrophobic, which means it gets repelled. And that means that we can't eliminate those toxins if we can't transform them into a water-soluble compound, which is really what phase 1, phase 2 is all about, phase 1 specifically. What ends up happening is it gets repelled by the water content of urine or the water content in your intestines and your stool, and so you can't get rid of it, and it just ends up recirculating. And so phase 1 is an enzyme-based system. Phase 2 is what we call a conjugation-based system. I'm thinking that we're probably going to end up having to do a short mini-series on detoxification, just go through some of the stuff in more detail. But nevertheless, the classic organization of the liver as it relates to its detoxification role is rooted in this enzyme and conjugation system that takes a water-loving toxin and transforms it into a water-soluble form so that we can get rid of it through feces or urine or through sweat. And that same phase 1, phase 2 capacity exists in the microbiome itself. The healthy bacteria that should be living in your gut in high numbers with broad diversity exhibit the same enzyme pathways, the same conjugation pathways. And so when your microbiome is diminished, maybe because you are infected, maybe because you've used broad spectrum antibiotics, maybe because your diet is sparse in fermentable compounds that tend to promote abundance and diversity of your microbiome, what ends up happening is we lose part of our detoxification potential. And so hormones that are normally biotransformed and handled properly by the gut portion of your detoxification system don't get handled properly. and they recirculate, which then gets added to the pool of hormones you're making or taking. And worse, sometimes when we partly detoxify a hormone and we create these secondary or tertiary metabolites, and they get released back into circulation, what ends up happening is those are potentially more toxic than the original parent compound, and we add more problems to the system. And, this is perhaps, again, one of the reasons why natural medicine for centuries, if not longer, has prioritized gut health as well as things like detoxification. And we'll talk about why it's not always smart to start with the gut and why it's not always smart to start with detoxification, although I would say as a general strategy for the average person who has an uncomplicated problem, those are good places to start. But ideally, you want to work with someone who understands all this and can look at you as an individual person and say, here's your main problem, here's where we start. And maybe it is or maybe it isn't the gut or the detoxification process, but maybe it is. We don't know until we look or ask the right questions. So that's the summary, and I know I kind of flew through that, but I try to get in a lot of information in the shortest period of time that I possibly can. So let me just go back and give you that top level again. When we're looking at the 5 pillars of hormone balance and control, we've talked about insulin and blood sugar, we've talked about stress chemistry and adrenal status, and how those are interlinked. And now we folded in gut health, and we broke it down into 3 different categories. That is whether or not you're inflamed and what that means. Your gut is inflamed. I mean, do you have a certain type of bacterial infection that's creating an increased beta-glucuronidase? And what is your microbiome's contribution to your phase 1, phase 2 detox systems? All of these apply to being able to handle some kind of a hormone load and not being able to create more inflammatory toxic intermediates as you try to process that. All right, I'm going to leave it there, and next time we'll be back and we'll talk about detoxification, not in a super ton detail, but we'll go into a little bit more detail than what we did today. All right, take care. We'll see you the next time on The Inflammation Nation. Thank you so much for listening to The Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.